Welcome to Shelf Help. Today we're speaking with Ian Tecklin, founder and CEO of Ripi, the fairly recently launched fast-growing frozen pasta brand based out of New York City. Prior to Ripi, Ian led early-stage investments in new incubations for a family office, did strategy and corp dev work at an ad tech company, and also global talent agency, UTA, which you may be familiar with. So lots of great experience. First off, just for the listeners that aren't that familiar with Rippy, just give us a quick lay of the land in terms of an origin story, why behind the brand, core products in the lineup today, and then maybe just a few places people can get their hands on them today, and then we'll go from there.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me on. Love the pod, love the eps that you've released, and so appreciate the opportunity to tell our story. So Rippy, it's short for the Italian word ripieno, which means filling or stuffing. So it speaks to not only our core product of frozen stuffed pasta, but also the whole brand ethos of filling life with more of the good stuff. Ultimately, I see a massive opportunity to disrupt what historically has been a stale legacy category of frozen pasta where the average brand is 65 years old. Everyone's focused on the same basic standard flavors like cheese, spinach and cheese, mushroom, butternut squash. The packaging is fairly similar across the board. And no one's really leaned into social to create engaging content and foster a sense of community online. And all you have to do, frankly, is look at what Graza has done in olive oil, Fishwife and tinned fish, Truff and hot sauce, Jenny's and Van Leeuwen and ice cream, Mila and frozen dumplings. There's example after example of all of these challenger brands who've introduced premium chef-driven products, had a unique voice on social, and found success. And to me, frozen pasta is that next frontier that's ripe for disruption, and we want to be that next big challenger brand. And so I partnered with this guy, Joe Sasto, who was on Top Chef twice, has done a lot for the Food Network, is very well known on social for his pasta making. I had initially DM'd him 5 years ago when I first thought of Rippy and can get into sort of what that origin looked like. Didn't launch it at the time, but when it came time to really pursue this, brought him on as our chief culinary officer. And with his help, we officially launched our first three SKUs this past February. So we've got a braised short rib ravioli with Swiss chard, Parmesan, and red wine. Got a chicken parm ravioli with crushed tomatoes, mozz, and basil, and a sweet potato ravioli with brown butter, rosemary, and maple. So it's meant to be sophisticated and elevated, but accessible at the same time, both from an ingredient perspective as well as a pricing perspective. And what we're doing is using frozen pasta as a vehicle to empower the average home chef and really help them elevate their weeknight meals.
I've heard you say that you're not just making better ravioli or reimagining ravioli, and I was going to ask kind of what this looks like, but I think you kind of just laid it out there.
Yeah, no, look, it's about prioritizing bold flavors, eye-catching design, not only from a packaging perspective, but from a social perspective, and just frankly, from a branding perspective, bringing energy and having, a modern brand voice and tone and ethos that frankly is bringing energy to a stale legacy category. That's what we're looking to do.
Let's rewind back to some of those earlier days working with your partner on some of that initial R&D formulation, when you're working on reimagining ravioli. So I mean, I imagine it definitely took a while to probably dial things in and find formulation process that worked. Without giving away any of your trade secrets or anything, what were like some of those kind of key variables you guys were playing around with, or kind of key tweaks you had to make along the way between that, so like the first version that came out versus the final version that you felt like this is right, this is what I'm ready to go to bat with? How many batches, months,
Yeah.
trial?
Yeah. A lot of batches, many months. It's funny when I look back or think back on, the whole R&D process. As I mentioned, I first thought of the idea for Rippy 5 years ago. This was June 2020. COVID, as we all recall, restaurants were shut down. People were cooking at home more than ever before. And I was walking the aisles of a grocery store by me when I was living in LA at the time, and had this light bulb moment, and I thought, why can't the freezer aisle, specifically frozen pasta, why can't there be, sophisticated, unique flavor profiles that are, different and accessible from an ingredient and pricing perspective? I'm a born and raised New Yorker. Like so many people, have come to love some pretty amazing pasta dishes, for places like Missy and Lilia and Lartuzzi and Via Carota. And I thought, why can't that type of quality be available in the freezer aisle? And if you can, lean really into uh, unique packaging and bold flavor profiles and have a unique voice on social, then it's a very interesting proposition. And having been a Top Chef fan my whole life, and I think that's my favorite show in the world, I DM'd Joe just out of the blue and said, "Hey, huge fan, have a crazy idea for a pasta venture. Can I tell you more about it?" And coincidentally, he lived 5 blocks away from me in LA at the time. And
Okay.
so for the next 6, 8 months during COVID, every week he would drop off a different stuffed pasta version, different filling, a different dough option, different shape option. And we continue to tweak the ratios of the ingredients accordingly for each, call it SKU. We have a recipe book of, 70 to 80 flavors right now.
Oh, wow.
And so we spent so much time during COVID. Ultimately, with the world upside down, I didn't think it was the right time to launch a brand. And so I moved back to New York, started working at this family office, but I'd been thinking about Rippy every single day and ultimately got to this point where I decided, to dust off all the materials I'd put together a few years prior and pursue Rippy, after fully diligencing it. And in that whole process, re-engage with Joe from a small batch R&D perspective. And, at that time we had basically perfected our recipes on a small scale, but then we knew we obviously had to commercialize them and make them feasible at scale, in a manufacturing setting. And so I spoke to, I think, 18 co-packers. If there's someone who produces frozen pasta at scale, I've spoken to them, and we asked a number of key questions for us that were sort of non-starters, in terms of their ability to create IQF frozen stuffed pasta, them being USDA certified because we have two meat-based products, them being able to support the ravioli shapes we want to do, and then most importantly, having an R&D team in-house to work with us on this whole commercialization process. And so we launched the brand in February of this year, but last year was just a big behind the scenes build year, focusing on branding work with our agency, but most importantly on the product side, R&D with our co-packer. And we went through dozens of iterations, and we had Joe's small batch sample as a comparison, if you will. And we spent, virtually 12 months and probably around 10 months in R&D land last year. And genuinely, we were able to recreate Joe's recipes on a small scale, which is, incredible.
That's great. What was that process like that you find in the co-packer that you ended up circling around? And then once you found that one, was it hard to kind of get them to take a chance on a, upstart brand and getting them, convincing them to get excited enough to take, the risk on smaller production runs and kind of seeing the vision, or did they kind of get it right away?
I mentioned I had spoken to 18 co-packers. Obviously some were fast no's because they didn't want to work with us in R&D because they didn't have the capability or didn't have the bandwidth to lean in. So we went into, call it, various stages of discussions with different partners. The one we ultimately ended up working with, was willing to work with us and spend the time because they believed in the vision and the market opportunity and our ability to execute. Ultimately we're in it on a commercial side to have long-term partners, and it's just an amazing situation to be in that we found a commercial partner, our key production partner, who before we even launched was willing to take that risk, from a timing and bandwidth perspective on their end to lean in, to roll up their sleeves and go through again dozens of iterations to commercialize these initial recipes and make them feasible at scale,
Yeah.
which, I'm very grateful for.
When you're going from the kitchen, your partner's kitchen, to larger scale co-packer, was there any trade-offs you had to make?
No, it's a great question. For us, the one thing I will never make a concession on is on quality. It's quality. The product obviously has to taste great. I'd say if that's priority 1A, priority 1B being we have to be clean label and have transparent ingredients. It cannot, the back of the box cannot read like a periodic table where the average consumer has no idea what we're putting in our product. You look at our ingredients today on the back of our box, or side of our box, you're going to be familiar and know how to read every single, ingredient listed there. So that was the most important piece for me here. Um, so we didn't want to sacrifice on quality, obviously, but we have to, you know, make some, I don't want to call it concessions in a negative light, call it optimize efficiencies, if you will. There are things that we need to do in a commercialized setting because what we did on a small scale this is not feasible. Perfect example, our sweet potato ravioli with brown butter, rosemary, and maple. That on a small scale involved Joe taking sweet potatoes, cutting them in half, roasting them whole, putting them through a sieve, and mashing them together to get a sweet potato puree, and then mixing in brown butter and maple and rosemary and a few other seasonings. That's not scalable or efficient. And it's very laborious. It gets expensive. It's complex from a production lens. And so with that SKU, for example, we found a fantastic partner who provides a sweet potato puree, which is the same exact flavor and texture profile that Joe created on a small scale, but takes a fraction of the time. So that's one example that
Yeah.
comes to mind.
For someone that's, let's say, yeah, a year behind you, they're just starting that kind of co-packer search, trying to nail down who's going to be a good fit. Any things jump out in terms of recommendations, things they should just keep top of mind?
Yeah, I mean, the first is I would talk to as many co-packers as possible. There's for any category, unless you're a super niche product, there's a number of potential co-packing partners out there. And I would talk to them all and compare and contrast because they each have their own merits and considerations. The second one being know your non-negotiables. For us, it was, as I mentioned, having a co-packer who was USDA certified because we have two meat-based products. It was finding a co-packer who had an in-house R&D team and or capability to work with us over, many months. The third, I would say with that is someone who has small batch quality. They're not just so mechanized or industrial out of the gate. They can, craft unique flavor profiles with that sort of small touch flavor while not being too small from a production capacity lens in the sense of you being able to grow with them. And then the last piece, just from a financial lens, ensure that, the margins can support the business from the get go, that there's a clear path, importantly, on top of that to margin expansion as you scale. Because if your margins don't work out of the gate, you're sort of DOA. And especially if there's no clear path to margin expansion, over the next couple of years, then you have no business being in business.
Right. Totally. You mentioned you guys have a big recipe booklet. I think you said like 70 or so different
Yeah.
recipes. You watched those three. How'd you decide on which three to go with?
It's a great question because the benefit, obviously, and the benefit and downside of stuffed pasta is that there are endless filling options. And so you can get creative, very creative in terms of what you put in the pasta, which is great from a creativity lens, bad from a, call it, analysis paralysis lens, because, there's unlimited options. But for us, with our existing, SKUs we have in market and the ones, we're launching soon and or that are in our future pipeline, it's all about striking the right balance between something that's sophisticated and elevated, but accessible at the same time from an ingredient and pricing perspective. And we wanted something that was familiar and approachable, but, a bit more elevated at the same time. So short rib, I want to say everyone, but most folks know what a braised short rib, tastes like. It's rich, it's unctuous, it's homey. We wanted to capture that, essence in a pasta, in a ravioli, which I think we've done fantastically well. It's actually our best selling SKU right now. The second, the chicken parm, very familiar. Everyone knows that. I'm comfortable with saying everyone knows what a chicken parm tastes like, so it was familiar there. And then the third, with the sweet potato, there are so many, call it butternut squash products out in market today. We wanted a vegetable based product, knowing that we had the other two meat ones. And so we thought, okay, well, what's good from a color and texture and flavor perspective? Thought sweet potato, really could work well. And we were able to really elevate it by adding, brown butter and rosemary and maple. So it tastes, very, very homey and perfect for fall, actually, though I love it around. And so those were the initial three that we prioritized out of the gate. So there were some wacky flavors we also went into. We had initially planned to do a fourth SKU as well. It was going to be a spicy crab tortellini, so blue crab,
Wow.
Calabrian chili, and kale. But we could not get the margins to work. And so we scrapped it and ended up going with these three. And, it's been great so far.
Let's talk packaging design for a minute. Now, you obviously did some things right because I think you guys got some awards and some recognition pretty early on that front. What were some of like the key variables that were top of mind for you?
Yeah, and I appreciate the comment. Well, first I have to shout out and thank Raf and the Truffle team who were fantastic partners, still are fantastic partners. They're our agency and they worked with us from brand strategy, visual identity, packaging design, logo, web design, just sort of full service soup to nuts. For me, packaging was so important because that's the number one marketing vehicle for us as you think about countless people just walking the aisles of a grocery store and seeing it on shelves. So it had to pop, especially with the freezer aisle. The conventional, call it heritage value brands in the space today all have very similar packaging. We wanted something that immediately drew your attention from the coloring to the typography, but equally as important is that visual that you see in the front of the box, which is just a big ravioli, with the sauce dollop on top, which I just think is so striking visually. That was really important for us from a packaging lens. Obviously we didn't start with packaging first. It all goes back to sort of the initial brand ethos that we really drilled down on, which is providing restaurant worthy pasta without the reservation and using frozen pasta as a vehicle to empower the average home chef and instilling in consumers that we are doing the hard stuff so that they can enjoy the good stuff, which is one of our mantras. So we're, braising our short rib at scale. We're roasting our sweet potatoes. We're making the pasta dough. We're shaping the ravioli. We're cooking it, or par cooking it rather, and then freezing it. So all you have to do is drop it in boiling water for 3 to 3.5 minutes at home, and you have a true restaurant quality meal in a matter of minutes. All of that type of sentiment should be communicated one way or another on the packaging, whether it's just through the front or it's on the side panels or it's on the back. And I think we did a great job.
Yeah, totally agree with that. What you obviously narrowed, circled around a great agency partner. What would that decision making diligency process look like that helped you hone in on them?
Yeah, and again, I think this is where my background as an investor is helpful in terms of just diligencing every, call it, opportunity or consideration of this business. I mentioned with our co-packer talking to 18, manufacturers to land on the right partner. With our agency search, I probably spoke to a dozen agencies, large and small. What initially drew me was just Googling brands I admire or had heard about and finding their agency and then reaching out and having a number of calls, sometimes just one call, sometimes a couple. But for me, it was important to see the clients that they had worked with, the work obviously that they had done. It was important for me to find a full service agency because I wanted someone to provide a range of services all just under one roof. And then obviously the important piece of pricing. Those were sort of the key criteria for us. I think Truffle checked all of the boxes for us and we made the right choice there.
If I came to you and told you I was like launching a CPG brand, getting ready to kick off kind of brand packaging design, any kind of tips that come to mind or things
Yeah.
out for that holes in minds I can avoid?
Well, I would say the first is don't design for yourself, design for the shelf. I think a lot of founders make the mistake of falling in love with something that looks great on a laptop per se, not necessarily in store. And so I would say if you're in love with a particular packaging design, print it, tape it on a freezer door, stand 10 feet back. And that's sort of the test. There's a really big difference between what call it singular package looks like in isolation versus if you put it, whether in real life or digitally, what it'll actually look like on shelves. So that's the first piece. I think the second is not to go in order of priorities, just things that come to mind. Budgeting for photography and printing tests. That digital file isn't the finish line. It's just one component of the broader packaging design phase. And so you need to do a number of printing tests to ensure that there's color accuracy, to make sure that the substrate choice and finishing all are in coordination with, your color and how you want your product to feel. I think you can't sort of over iterate, if that makes sense. It'll never be perfect. Nothing's ever perfect, but try to get it to 90 to 95%, let's say, and launch. And, real consumer feedback will, I think, be more valuable than, another round of agency revisions, if you will.
Totally.
And then I'd say the last piece, actually two more that just come to mind. One is just, I would say clarity beats clever, meaning you have literally 3 seconds to tell someone what it is that you're selling and why it's different. I wouldn't try to be clever and bury the product name or flavor in design. It should be treated as a walking billboard, as I mentioned, and be very clear from the outset what it is that you're selling and why you're selling it and the value, that you're offering. And then the last piece is don't ignore, really, frankly, plan for the boring stuff. Getting your UPCs set up on GS1, getting your nutritional panels in order, your ingredient statements, all of the, call it, unsexy compliance work that ultimately could, call it, derail your timeline if you forget about it, is important to consider as you're, kicking off that process.
Shifting gears a bit, just from a go-to-market standpoint, I'm pretty sure you guys got a good number of retailers pretty quickly out the bat. I'm just curious, thinking back, tell me a bit about that journey of getting on shelf in terms of just getting that first buyer meeting or two, getting that first commitment or two, and kind of once you got that first or two yeses, kind of all the steps leading up to actually getting on shelf and ensuring doing everything you could to have a successful launch from there.
Yeah, we launched in February of this year, initially with 33 stores. We're now in, 8 months later, over 150 stores right now. I'd say the initial focus from a retail perspective, we wanted to prioritize the natural channel, wanted to prioritize the independent and specialty stores in this channel, just to, call it, crawl before we walk and dip our toes or get our skis under us operationally before we scale up and, are ready for the big players. And so the focus, really had been uh, geography, because you obviously can't be everywhere all at once, but we had targeted, Pacific Northwest and NorCal as one area, on the West Coast, or two areas, the New York metro area, because I'm here, my friends, family, investors are here. I want to be able to visit stores frequently. And then the third bucket is just called strategic ad hoc opportunities. So retailers that are outside the two areas that I just mentioned, but potentially unlock a larger opportunity through their ownership. So Market District is one example by Giant Eagle that we're in right now in the Midwest. Our first two retailers were Nugget Markets in NorCal and Hagen, in the Pacific Northwest. And we just made sure we launched there in February. So we started shipping out product, I believe, late December, early January, to make sure that we were ready. And, it was really important that we were buttoned up operationally, obviously being onboarded with UNFI and having those DCs activated, in those two areas. But from a production planning perspective, making sure that all of the packaging was printed in advance and ready to go. All of the raw materials were ordered and delivered in advance. And, demand planning is a bit tricky early on because there's no science to it. It's all sort of art. You can make some, estimates based on preliminary demand, but you don't really know until you get in it. Making sure that we obviously weren't shorting stores, that we had some, call it, backstop of inventory available. And, we launched pretty seamlessly. And 33 stores I mentioned in February, we're over 100 now. By the, call it, end of this year, we'll be in 700 stores. Really, what I'm excited by as well, though, over the next 6 months, we're rolling out to over 1,500 stores. We have some large logo accounts that, we'll announce at a later time. Be sure to let you know, though, that we're very excited about. And I think that just speaks to the the reality that a lot of these retail buyers that we're talking to see, the vision and business opportunity, frankly, the white space that we're going after, and have really leaned in accordingly.
What have you started to kind of find in terms of tools, on the ground tactics that actually have the most impact in terms of, maximizing velocity and driving sell through?
I'd say for us, it's the in-store promotional trade activity, that is driving the most call it in-store purchase right now. There's a lot of stuff that we're starting to do from a top of funnel social perspective just to get the word out there. And we have a lot of exciting stuff planned there. But in terms of call it in-store execution, it's really, TPRs and BOGOs and other similar call it trade tactics that we're prioritizing. We had dipped our toes a little bit in demos and sampling. It's a bit harder and comes with its own considerations as you think about demoing a frozen food, that's not ice cream. We need to boil water and plug in our portable stovetop and cook the pasta. And so there's just an added complexity there. But it's really, the in-store promos that we work with the stores on to drive trial, because that's my focus right now is to do everything we can, both from a top of funnel perspective on social and with the collabs that we're doing with creators and chefs and whatnot, to, in-store tactics that we're executing on, is to drive that initial purchase, to drive that initial trial, because the biggest challenge, but also the biggest opportunity for us as a brand is the preconceived notion that people have around frozen food. And when people think about frozen pasta, their minds automatically go to more conventional value brands like Lean Cuisine and Stouffer's, for example. And look, don't get me wrong, there's always going to be a market for those types of products. Our bet is there's also a large swath of the population who appreciate good food and are open and are looking for something a bit more sophisticated, a bit more elevated, that's again accessible from an ingredient to pricing perspective. And so it takes time, to invest in the brand and convince folks that the freezer aisle can in fact be a destination for delicious food. And I'm convinced once you buy our product, you try our product, the quality is there that you're going to become a repeat customer. And so it's about driving, that initial trial across a number of different ways. And I've seen success so far. And now as we ramp up into larger stores, we want to, really accelerate growth.
Yeah.
Frozen pasta, we're competing obviously with the conventional value brands today, but increasingly with private label brands, these retailer owned and operated brands. And so there's only so much shelf space available. And so it's really about what is the value that you're providing to the retailer that would convince, this retail buyer to give you an extra shelf placement or an extra row, whatever that looks like. For us, it's a two-pronged argument, which is you're selling, hey, as in to the retail buyer, you're selling primarily the same conventional value brands today, in addition to your private label product. Swap out your lowest performing non-private label brand, and replace it with Rippy. Existing customers who like that brand will either trade into a similar branded product or to your private label product, or they'll trade up to a premium brand like Rippy. So it's an incremental margin opportunity for you. But also, given our brand ethos and our flavor profiles and our packaging, and the fact that we're a modern brand bringing energy to a stale category, we're bringing a new type of buyer to the freezer aisle as well. So it's that, call it dual argument, that two-pronged argument that we've been giving to retailers. I'd imagine that's very similar to a lot of other brands, in other categories. We're not entirely calling reinventing the wheel, at least in frozen pasta we are, but that pitch has been applicable to other categories where you've seen, success with certain challenger brands. And so that's why, we've seen pretty good pickup so far from retail stores in terms of them buying in. That's why on average, most stores are taking 3 SKUs. And we're actually launching another SKU in January, with a notable retailer, and that'll be our fourth, and we're launching a fifth SKU with a notable retailer in the spring. And so come springtime, we'll have 5 SKUs. I think we'll
Nice.
cap, each box right now, it's a 9-ounce box, feeds 2 people comfortably. I think we'll cap this at maybe 8 SKUs total. So in an ideal world, if we could take over 2 rows now with 4 across at a retailer, that would be amazing. But again, it's just about continuing to communicate that value prop and obviously having the retail sell-through data speak for itself.
Yeah. Any sneak peeks into what those next SKUs are coming, or too early so far?
It's a little early, but I will tell you, I'm happy to hop on back on the pod, or I'll text you on the
We'll do,
slide.
we'll do
Um,
that too.
it's this business is at a very interesting inflection point where, we're only 8 months old, but look, I'm very proud and happy with all we've accomplished to date, but I'm very excited by the near term pipeline that we have. And, very rarely, and I say this humbly, Very rarely is there a situation where a young brand like ours gets an opportunity to sell in, some pretty major stores. And so really want to, you know, prove this out and obviously spread the ravioli love and convince folks that the freezer aisle can be a destination for delicious food. And so that same mantra of, striking that balance between sophistication and elevation, but accessibility, that's going to be applicable to all of the SKUs that we launch, all of the products we launch in the future.
Taking a bigger step back, just talking about this frozen category in general, it definitely seemed like it's getting a lot of attention right now. There's a lot of cool things happening. Like yeah, what do you feel like is kind of unique about this category versus all of the other non-frozen SKUs?
Yeah, I think look, the frozen category's been around for a while, but I think it's having a renaissance right now. It's having a real moment. All you have to do is look at what Whole Foods, and this just validates the proof of concept for us, but Whole Foods, released their 2026 trends for their stores are really the industry at large. And number five on that list, that forecast was freezer fine dining, which I think perfectly captures what Rippy is all about. It's been in our DNA. It's been part of that core thesis since I first thought of the business 5 years ago. We are still in the top of the first inning as it relates to this whole premiumization of the freezer aisle. But that's where the puck is going. I think, as I mentioned, the freezer aisle has been around for decades, but I feel like people really started to think about it seriously in terms of being a destination for innovation around COVID. When restaurants were shut down, people were cooking at home more than ever before. They wanted elevated at-home dining experiences because they didn't want to go out, or they couldn't go out for whatever reason. I feel like that's when most consumers, and it's just a gut check, anecdotal based on my experience and others I've spoken to, but I feel like that's when people really started to take the freezer aisle seriously. And all you have to do is look at a number of categories across the freezer aisle. These are brands that have popped up over the last few years, and you can see the type of innovation that's possible. Whether it's Mila and Laoban and Dumpling Daughter and frozen dumplings, whether it's Jesse and Ben's in the frozen veggie space with their French fries, whether it's True Fruit in the frozen novelty space, Evergreen in the frozen waffle. There's been category after category, throughout the freezer aisle that have proven that innovation is possible. And to us, frozen pasta is an untouched category. It's going to be that next big area that's ripe for disruption. And we want to be that big challenger brand to take it on and be a category leader accordingly. And so what it enables us, the freezer aisle is to be and to really be a convenient indulgence, meaning we have a 12-month shelf life. And so we go through a flash freezing process, which in its own right has its own benefits by locking in, that flavor and freshness and preserving that nutritional value, but also the convenience factor that it affords in that you could park us in your freezer for 12 months, though I'd hope you would eat us sooner than that. Take us out, enjoy us whenever you want, on a weekly basis, bi-weekly, however often you want to eat pasta. And simply boil water and drop us in for 3 to 3.5 minutes, and you have a true restaurant quality meal, at a fraction of the price of going out while not settling for subpar quality with value brands.
Totally.
That's what the freezer aisle affords. That's why I'm so excited by it. And, I feel like every year that's gone by since I first thought of this idea, I just become even more and more bullish on the frozen category. And, I think consumers in large are going to really catch up because again, I really do think it's early and we're in the top of the first inning here. But again, that's where the puck is going ultimately.
It does seem like this category from a merchandising and POP standpoint can be more challenging. You're sitting behind a freezer door, maybe freezer clings are things you're doing, but shelf talkers and that kind of stuff just don't really make a whole lot of sense. Anything you found to kind of get around some of those just challenges that everyone has in this space and anything that can have a real impact?
Yeah, unfortunately, you nailed it. The reality is with I'd say most, 99% of retail stores, there really aren't secondary freezer placements.
Right.
Merchandising is limited. And so that's why it's so important, going back to our discussion on the packaging front, to have something that pops, to use promos effectively to drive that initial trial. Because It's not like a Graza, for example, and I absolutely love that brand. It's not like a shelf stable product like that, which is also ubiquitous, and able to be applied across a number of different areas. You can't merchandise us throughout the store. There's really only one area primarily in which we can be placed, which, is a downside. I do have this sort of wish list of things that stores can be doing, but who knows if, that'll ever happen.
Right. Totally. Yeah. I think that's a good reality check. I mean, on that front, I'm not sure if you have ever even time to think about this or whatever, but if like you got an opportunity to kind of redesign the entire frozen section layouts or
I think about this all the time.
this, like, what could that potentially look like?
Yeah, well, one, I would increase a bunch of things because I think about this all the time. One is bringing frozen forward in the store. Typically most stores have the freezer aisle, sort of in the back of the store. That's how I often see it. Some are center store and whatnot, but I would treat frozen products as part of meal discovery, not an afterthought at the end of a grocery run.
Yeah.
That's first and foremost, call it philosophically, but there's things you could be doing in terms of moving us around in stores. The second is, to the extent possible, I would increase the number of frozen end caps and secondary placements. Like, I love the idea of having glass door islands or mini freezers in high traffic zones. You see that sometimes with ice cream. I feel like Yasso, has these coolers everywhere, or like Mimo, I forgot the brand,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
that had those everywhere by cash registers. You don't really see that for frozen meals, frozen pasta, for example.
Yeah. Good point.
But I think that's certainly an opportunity. And what that enables is also just cross merch opportunities with sauces or wines, for example, if they sell alcohol. There's basically limited to no merchandising opportunities for frozen brand today. And then the last piece, I would just say better or improved presentation, better lighting, having digital screens perhaps, or QR codes that can show the chef and brand stories to really make frozen feel curated and not so industrialized. I think those are a lot of things I think about. More and more retailers are prioritizing the freezer aisle. They're investing more in expanding, their frozen offerings. And so the curation itself, I think, brings an aura of discoverability by having the average consumer walk by and see, whoa, look at all these brands. That's part of the whole notion of having people see the freezer aisle as a destination for delicious food. But on top of that, obviously, there's, I think, a number of areas that retailers can get creative from a merchandising perspective.
Yeah. Totally. For someone that's considering maybe building a brand that's gonna be focused on this frozen category, any kind of things they should keep top of mind other than don't do it? This may
It's not for the faint of heart. You have to have a high level of conviction, for me personally, I mentioned I was an investor before this, led early stage investing at a family office, did for a talent agency before that. And, you know, I always told myself I wouldn't leave a, call it, nice, comfortable situation unless I had a high level of conviction around whatever idea I came up with. You have to have a lot of conviction around the white space, the business and market opportunity. And most importantly, your ability to execute first and
Yeah.
foremost.
Totally.
But then once you've decided, okay, yeah, I do want to launch a frozen brand, so there's a number of things that people should keep in mind. I'd say packaging matters more. You've heard me say the word packaging a lot because it's so important. It must stand out through glass. You have to test out how it looks, how your packaging would look under condensation, under a glare, what it looks like, 10 feet back, for example. There's limited, as we just talked about, merchandising opportunities. And so that's your real estate. So how do you make that billboard as sexy as possible? The second is really nail down that pitch to retail buyers. As I mentioned, frozen, there's only a finite amount of space available. You need to show these retail buyers, why you're a value add here, why you'll drive new traffic or provide an incremental margin opportunity, or bring a new type of buyer to the category. I mentioned our sort of two-pronged approach. I think every brand is different, but there has to be some justification, whether it's on the product side, whether it's on the ingredient side, whether it's on whatever it is, in terms of being able to convince a retail buyer to bring you on. And then the last piece I would say is just ops are everything. Find a co-packer and or a 3PL that specifically specializes in frozen, not just one that can
Yeah.
handle.
Yeah.
That's really important.
Last question for you. Any like trends or brands in this frozen category beyond, let's say, like the frozen pasta category that you're tracking, or if anything outside of frozen in general in the CPG that you've gotten you excited about lately?
Yeah, look, from a frozen lens, there's a number of brands that I admire that, just have proven out that innovation, as I mentioned, is possible in the freezer aisle. And these are brands I mentioned like Mila and Jesse and Ben's and True Fruit and Evergreen. They're ushering in a new wave. I'd like to think Rippy, is on par with those brands, for frozen pasta, but they've each disrupted stale legacy categories. They have clean label, fantastic branding, fantastic product. Um, those are brands I admire. I'd say those are comps for us in terms of the level of innovation that's possible in the freezer aisle today. And then there are brands outside the freezer aisle that I admire just simply because of their branding and ability to build community, and their packaging is great. Fishwife, Graza, Saws, those brands come to mind. And so for us, it's about meshing, those two comps, if you will, really drilling down on branding and community, and leaning in and investing in social accordingly, while also proving out that, we can be a destination brand in the freezer aisle, and, a challenger brand accordingly.
Yeah. Well, yeah, Ian, this has been awesome. Really appreciate the time. A lot of really great insights here. I think people are getting a lot of value out of this. What's the best place for people to follow along with Rippy, and then best place to follow along with you as well?
Yeah. Well, first off, thanks so much for having me on. This has been fun. Always good to talk pasta, talk frozen. You can follow us at Rippy Foods on Instagram and TikTok. I'm in LinkedIn, Ian Tecklin, and yeah, I appreciate the time.
Yeah, likewise. I think that's the pod.